Brendan, what do you make of this? I mean, especially on the world is going to end front, we've heard a lot about how the floods in Germany and then the floods in London are, the harbinger of the kind of apocalypse to come.
I think we're starting to see just how cultish environmentalism has become and how religious it's become. And I don't mean that as an insult to religious people. There are all sorts of interesting and good religious people, but the politics of climate change, the climate change alarmism has become this kind of end of world cultish worldview. That's what it is. The way it talks about, floods as a kind of lesson for mankind, a punishment for our hubris. It talks about the coming apocalypse, the wiping out of human life, potentially the wiping out of all life. It has this idea of sin, this notion that if you do certain things, you are harming the environment, you're harming the polar bears, you're harming the ozone layer. I don't know if people talk about the ozone layer anymore, but you're harming something or other. And therefore you need to self-flagellate, you need to do penance, you need to recycle a certain amount in order to make up for your eco sin. So it's a very religious movement. And I think the floods that have taken place, the ones in Europe have been absolutely devastating. There have also been floods in London. And what I've noticed is that lots of people with a green mindset almost relish these kinds of events because they hold them up instantly as proof of their thesis. And this is what we are going to get. And what they're essentially saying is this is what we deserve because we've dared to live in an industrialized modern society that emphasizes economic progress and economic growth, although not enough as far as I'm concerned. So it has this very religious feel to it. But I think I really agree with the point Ella's making. There's always been this contradiction in environmentalism between, on the one hand, the crazy claims they make about the coming apocalypse and how disastrous it will be, billions wiped out and the planet on fire, etc. And what they then demand that people do. And what they demand that people do is, separate your rubbish or drive to the supermarket less or, go on holiday once a year rather than twice a year. So, or if you go on one of their demonstrations, which they used to have a lot of in the past, and it would all be about the end of the world, but they'd all be dancing and waving things around. And there was always a mismatch between what they claimed and what they did. And so I think it's a confused movement. They don't really know what they're talking about, but it seems to me that the engine of it is this depressive misanthropic view that mankind is a destructive force, a plague on the planet, and we are going to land in the crap if we don't start changing our ways. And pushing back against that and against net zero, which I think is a crazy idea, I think that's very important for progressives to do.
And also, if we just think about the kind of practicalities of net zero, I mean, the heat pump news has been, the one dominating the news this week. The boiler ban being pushed back to 2040. I mean, the reality is that this is a great example of how the kind of cart has been put before the horse. The target of carbon neutrality put before the technology exists to realize it. Because these heat pumps, whatever we might think of them, technology is technology, but they're just not the same as gas boilers. And they cannot heat most homes up to normal room temperature a lot of the time. And they cost a fortune to install. And then, it's strange because the average person, unless they're given huge government subsidies, which the Chancellor doesn't want to do, is going to spend a lot of money to convert their existing well-working boiler into something that doesn't keep their house warm. And I thought that was a pretty standard thing to expect in a developed country that, we can no longer take for granted thanks to net zero and thanks to, climate policy.
Yeah, it's the presentism, the way of thinking about things in a real kind of short-term mindset that is one of the biggest barriers here. And it's not just about sort of not being able to look into the future. It's, as Brendan says, a misanthropic aversion to doing anything rather than just tinkering around the edges. I mean, part of the problem with the heat pump question is it's all very well and actually should happen if governments want to, for example, build new towns and new cities and use, when you're building those houses, use the most efficient and wasteless form of energy that is cost effective and can still heat your house to, a reasonable temperature for a reasonable price. What's not to love about that? But the fact is, huge numbers of people in the UK are living in houses that, if they have to be retrofitted, will be unworkable. And, is everyone in their council flat going to have a solar panel on their window? It's just so ridiculous and is a kind of short-term mindset. But the important thing about if you take the example of the floods, I mean, there was this discussion of it being, obviously they did look biblical and they were horrendous and people lost their lives. But rather than seeing it as the way environmentalists put it is that nature kind of biting back at us, and this is the cost that you pay for living and breathing and expending energy, seeing it as a problem that human beings might have contributed to, but that human beings can innovate out of. So for example, in London, having better drainage, thinking about where you put tarmac in a different way, all these very practical, sensible, reasonable issues that when you put a kind of kibosh on any discussion about, it has to be carbon neutral, it has to be energy less, it has to be green. If you don't give yourself the space to think about practical and innovative ways of moving forward and celebrate the idea that human beings will be the drivers of those ways of thinking, then you're never going to move anywhere. Then nothing is ever going to change. And actually, what we should embrace is that things do change. We want things to change. We want things to be more efficient.